So last week we started a new series called Pressing On, and we established that we needed to be gospel strong. We needed to be gospel strong because that's where joy comes from. Last week was kind of the foundation message to the series, and it's one that I've been studying Philippians for probably over a month now, which has been the first time that I've really dug in, and I've gotten other people with me to study for, and so I'm really excited about this series because there's a lot of awesome things in Philippians, and I believe that there are some people in our church and in our community that could use what this book has to say in their lives. But remember last week we said we needed to be gospel strong. We needed to have joy that lasted because remember last week that I said when my primary concern is for my happiness, I surrender my life to my circumstances. Do you remember me saying that last week? That when my primary focus in life is when I'm trying to be happy, when my goal is to be happy, then what I am doing is surrendering everything in my life to circumstances around me because let's face it, our circumstances are what makes us happy, right? If I have a lot of money, I'm happy. If I stub my toe, I'm not very happy, right? Okay. But even in the midst of certain things, in those circumstances, I give away control. I actually give myself over to slavery. If you want to take it that far, you want to play this idea out, you give yourself over to slavery because now my focus is all on how I control my circumstances. Have you ever thought about that before? That if you are primarily trying to be happy and that's what your goal is in life, then what you end up doing is trying to manage the circumstances that are going on around you. So I'm trying to make work better in my life. I'm trying to make my body happy because if my body's happy, I'm happy. I'm trying to make things at church happy. I want things to be a certain way, and so if that's right, then I'll be happy. If my relationship with my spouse is a certain way, then I will be happy. And those things can change in an instant, right? Right, married people? Things can change in an instant. Yeah. All right. So that's what happens, right? Is those circumstances are beyond our control, and so now when I focus on how I control my circumstances, I can become withdrawn. I can become grumpy. I can shelter myself from all the worry and this strife that this world will give me, or I can get strong in something else. I can become gospel strong. I can have faith. I can have joy. Not just happiness, but joy because I realize that this is not my permanent home. Amen? I mean, thank goodness that this is not a permanent home. And we live in one of the best countries in the world, right? I mean, holy cow. If this is as good as it gets, let's get out of here, all right? But because I realize that this is not my permanent home, because I realize that what happens here is just for a time, that's how I can have joy because it's not forever. Isn't it great when you're sick and you're just like in bed, deathly sick, and you're just sitting there like, all I want to do is sleep and I just need to get through this. Like, I know, but what happens, I could do that any day of the week, it'd be nice, but all you want to do is just sit in bed, and sometimes you've had that thought, like, I don't think it's a serious thought, but you have that thought, like, I just want to die because it's so terrible, right? And you're just like sitting there and you're just like, I just want this to be over, and there is hope that it will be over someday, right? Because you're walking through that sickness and you're just like, I know I'm going to get better. I know like in a week, it stinks right now that I can't go to work or I can't enjoy what I was going to enjoy. Maybe it happens during a vacation. You can't enjoy your vacation. But ultimately, you know that next time it'll be better because this will disappear. This will be done after a little while. And that's what I'm talking about is that kind of a hope because I realize that if I put my faith in Jesus Christ, I have a much better home waiting for me. With someone more important than my spouse, than my kids, than my parents, than my friends, or than my boss. Because think about that. You get to be with Jesus. You get to be in the very presence of God. One of the things that Christians probably get stressed out about enough, or the most, is that when we can't hear from God, when we don't feel like God is near us. Would you agree with that? As in our Christian spiritual lives, we get so frustrated when we don't feel like we're close to God. And this is what heaven is we are close to God all the time. Being in church all the time. And there ain't no preacher preaching to us. It's Jesus ministering to our souls. Would that not be amazing to be a part of that kind of a thing? That is what we're talking about. And so it's amazing to have that hope. It's incredibly freeing to look at that problem and not be ruled by it. You see, I can bet at some point in your life something has happened and you couldn't sleep at night because it consumed your thoughts, right? Something has happened in your life and it just consumes your mind. You can't go to sleep because you're constantly thinking about it. You can't do other things because you're completely distracted by it. Your work productivity goes down. Your relationships are abandoned. Different things happen and your mind gets consumed by these things. Your brain just keeps trying to process the issue. And I know that I've been there. I'm sure many of you have as well. You might have a problem at work, an issue with your spouse, a storm coming your way. You might have money issues. But all of these things are things that consume our minds. But when you learn to press on through them and not to build a cocoon around yourself, you can take the walls down around you because you know that what is happening is only for a time. When you know what is right, when you know what is wrong, then that's when you can be free, when you can experience joy, when you can look at suffering in the eye and say, back off because I'm pressing on right through you. You see, being gospel strong allows us to suffer strong. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about joy in the midst of suffering. Philippians really is a book themed on joy in the midst of suffering. And we're going to just kind of begin to lay kind of the next piece of this puzzle together because I want to talk about how suffering actually advances the gospel. What's the primary purpose of Christians in the world today? As it has been for all time. Serve the Lord, glorify God, right? To basically love God and love others, right? That's the greatest commandment. Or the second commandment, I'll smash into one fun little saying. Love God, love others. We're here to glorify God. How do we glorify God? Oh, I'm getting interactive today. You guys don't like that. You just want to listen. How do we do that? We serve God, right? How do we serve God? We're going to worship Him. Now, worship isn't just Sunday morning. It's a lifestyle, right? Yeah, so parents, when you're at home with your kids, you got to model a lifestyle of worship. That's difficult sometimes. Somebody went, uh-oh. All right? So that means that we talk about God. We do all those kinds of things. In our entire lives, we worship. It also means we open our mouths and we tell people about Jesus, does it not? Yeah. That we live out the gospel with our lives so that when people look at us, they see something different than what they see in the world. All right? And that's the thing here that we're looking at is that when we live in the world, when we want to glorify God, we're going to read in a minute, that Paul says, live a life worthy of the gospel. Live a life worthy of Jesus Christ. Live a life worthy of the resurrection that is coming to you, the righteousness that is imputed to you, that has been given to you. Live a life that is worthy of all these things. And so that's how we serve God, is we respond to the incredible gift that He's given us that we didn't deserve. And we worship Him as a result. And we want other people to be freed from their sin. We want other people to be freed from the guilt, from the judgment that they are going to receive. And so what do? We spread and advance the gospel message of Jesus Christ to other people in the world. Suffering actually advances the gospel. And I want to show you how that happens today. Because it seems that it wouldn't, right? Like, how does my suffering advance God's message of the gospel? Like how does my financial trouble advance the gospel? Anybody got an answer? Okay, that's a possibility. Faith? Absolutely. But how does that, in your life, exactly, that's advancing the gospel. How do you show other people that? How does my sickness advance the gospel and glorify God? Like, for real, when I'm staring death in the face, like, how in the world does that glorify God and advance the gospel? How does my misfortune advance the gospel to the glory of God? It's not often I see something on Facebook and I go, oh, that's dead on. There's a lot of stuff on Facebook that is just completely off base, and that's okay, because it just reveals, Facebook really is a window into the world of everybody's mind. They take off the mask and they just, it just goes out, right? All right. So if you have it, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't get on it. But it's not often that I see something, and there's this picture with some words on it, and I actually shared this one because it said this. It said, consequence is when your life falls apart because of bad choices that you've made. Suffering is when your life falls apart because of good choices that you've made. Consequence is when life falls apart because of bad choices that you've made. Suffering happens when your life falls apart because of good choices that you've made. There is a complete difference between consequence and suffering. All right? So, when I say suffering, I'm not necessarily talking about all the bad things that happen to us. Because the principle of personal responsibility would dictate that if I mess up, if I am unwise, if I sin, then what do? I own up. I own up and I face whatever I have coming to me. I made my bed, now I'm going to lie in it, right? That principle that not many people live by anymore. All right? That's tough, but it's not necessarily suffering because it's precluded by sin or otherwise unwise activity. Money is the easy one to give an example here because it's important that we be good stewards of the resources that God has given to us, right? Yeah, I think so. We're called to be wise with it. So if I decide that I want to drive a $20,000 car when our household only brings in $30,000 a year, is that wise? No, it's not wise. So in the event that I lose it, and if I can't afford other necessities in life, or if I can't obey God's instructions to be generous with the resources that He's given me, that isn't suffering. That is what? That is a consequence of my actions. If my car gets taken away and I come into church and be like, my car got taken away, you can look at me and go, suck it up and live with it. All right? Because you're only 27 years old. You shouldn't have a $20,000 car in the first place, right? Yeah, that's the way it works. But that's the point, is that there's consequence and suffering. So an example of financial suffering is more like being absolutely frugal, buying only what is necessary, altering every way that you live in order to make it work and you still not have enough money to buy it and cover the necessities of life. When I do absolutely everything in my power to do what is right and it still doesn't work out for me, that's suffering. When you do the right thing at your job instead of the shady thing, and you get looked over for promotion or raise, whatever that is, that's suffering. That's not consequence. And that's a lot of times what we do is we look at this and we go, well, I will suffer if I don't do X, Y, and Z. If I do the right thing, then that consequence, we get them kind of mixed up a little bit sometimes in our minds. And it's important that we understand what Christ-like suffering looks like. When what the Bible says is suffering, that's what we look at as suffering. So when I do things that are right and it brings on unfavorable results, that's suffering. So consequences is a result of bad choices I've made. Suffering is a result of good choices that I've made. So with that in mind, let's get into Philippians and see what Paul has to teach us today. Sound good? I need you to turn to Philippians chapter 1. We're going to start with verse 12 today. I'll give you a second to turn there. If you have a tablet, go ahead and use it. If you have your phone, use it. I'm all right with those things. I'm going to be using the ESV today to read out of, English Standard Version. So if you have an NIV or King James or New American Standard Bible, whatever it is, it's going to sound a little different, but they've all been translated from the same language. So Philippians chapter 1, verse 12 says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now there's a couple of things that you can surmise just from this one verse, and I want to stop here to talk about it. Paul is in prison for telling people about Jesus. I want you to understand that right out of the gate. Paul is in prison for telling people about Jesus. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't against the law. People were they just didn't like it because it was messing with their livelihood, it was annoying them, whatever it was. So people complain, and the police, the Romans, were like, okay, you're done. We're going to put you in jail so that these people shut up and you shut up at the same time. So, that's kind of the way it works, right? So we don't like what this is happening. So he's on lockdown, and he's writing this letter, and there's no doubt to the Christians in Philippi have heard about this. All right? So Philippians is a letter to the Philippian people in Philippi. Does that make sense? Usually there's a reason why things are named the things that they are. My favorite is Acts, because I always thought, Acts, that's kind of a weird name. And it's like, well, it's for the Acts of the early church. And I went, oh, that's silly. Like, right? So usually there's a reason for the name. Same thing with Exodus. Exodus is named Exodus because of the Exodus out of Egypt, right? So there's usually common sense. Like, it's not just this mysterious thing. So Philippians, Paul is writing a letter to the Christians at Philippi. And he sometimes will refer to them as the church, but what is the church? People. The church is people. It's not a building. It's not an organization. He mailed this out to the Christians at Philippi and said, you guys need to read this because God's speaking through me here. So he's on lockdown. He's writing this letter, and there's no doubt that the Christians have heard about the fact that he's in prison. And they're worried because it's not just that he's in jail. It's he's got a trial coming up that could result in his beheading. He could die very soon. All right? So this isn't good. And at first glance, there's not much that's happening to God's glory in this situation. But Paul is saying this is actually advancing the gospel. Did you see that? He says that. Right in verse 12, he says, this is what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So he's in jail, he's facing death, and he's going, yeah, God's will is getting done anyway. There's some things we can learn from this. So in fact, in verse 13, Paul says that the whole imperial guard has come to know the gospel and that people are aware that he's in prison for Christ. Think about that. If you go to jail, are you going to be singing Jesus' praises in the middle of jail? How great is our God? You know, like, I'm in jail today. It's amazing, right? You know, you're probably going to be like, I don't like this. You're going to be a little tense. You're going to be a little upset. You're going to be like, I didn't deserve to be here, especially if you're in Paul's situation. I was just talking about Jesus. And that's what's going on. So in verse 14, he says, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Now, this is powerful. Because let's talk about this in terms of dodgeball. How many of you have played dodgeball before? Good. I'm glad that most of you have. I was wondering if that was going to be the case. Most of us have seen a game of dodgeball, though, right? Okay. If you haven't played it before. All right. I love dodgeball because I'm actually kind of good at it, and I'm not super athletic, so it's perfect. All right. I'm a big target, but I can move. All right. And so we played this at camp, and I was at camp 3 weeks ago. And when they said dodgeball, I instantly went, I don't know if I'm going to be good at this anymore. Like most of the things that I haven't done in 6 years. All right. So my family group at camp, there's 5 family groups, and they want to turn it into a tournament. So we had to divide into 4 teams. So my all-guy family group had to divide into 4 teams, and we had to go visit the other teams. My team landed with one of the most scared teams that could possibly happen. So 3 of us guys went over to this team, and so like we're on the front lines. And I'm going, oh, this is not good because I'm a big target, and I can't throw worth nothing, all right? And so here we go. And my team clobbered the other team. It was awesome. It was so cool. It was great. But beside the point, I want you to think about this in dodgeball. So usually when you play a dodgeball, there are a couple of aggressive people on the front lines, right? And then the rest of the team kind of hangs in the back, like, I don't want to get hit by the ball. All right? If you're not playing professionally. Hopefully if you're if there's a professional thing going on, then it's better. But usually every time that I've played it in youth group or participated in it, there's people that hang out in the back because they're not confident in themselves. They're sitting back on the sidelines because they can't throw a ball because they're not sure they can move out of the way fast enough, and they just don't want to hurt their team, ultimately. Can you identify with that a little bit? Okay. So that's usually what happens. You've got 2 kind of sections going on. You got the front lines, and you got kind of the support structure in the back. They'll get the balls and throw them back up to the front line so they can keep throwing and all that kind of stuff. But they're sitting back, not very confident in their abilities. But when the front line gets taken down, what happens? The back line's got to rise to the occasion, right? They got to come up. And they got to start putting their effort in. And a lot of times, like I've seen it happen more than once, that a lot of times those arrogant frontline people that are like, yeah, we're awesome, they get out, and then the backup team comes in and wins the game. And they kick butt. It's really kind of cool to see. Like in high school one time, we were playing this in a gym for like a pep assembly or something, and it was like the smallest girl, like she was so scared of everything coming at her, and she was just like, she would hold a ball and she would just like jump back and forth between them, and then she would just rocket that ball and bullseye, one guy would go down, and it was so cool to see that happen. And what I want to, the same thing happens in the church. So like, there are people perfectly capable of doing the work that others are doing, but either they feel like the position is saturated or they think that the other person can do it better. All right? This is what happens. The same thing that happens in dodgeball happens in the church. All right? But when that person either moves on to a different work or leaves the church, it's those people that will step into the gap because they know how important that job is to advance the gospel. Make sense? So you thought I was crazy about talking about dodgeball. All right? I mean, it's not exactly logical that Paul is in jail and facing death, that others would step into his gap. But that's why we lock up criminals, right? Like in order to stop them from doing what they did to other people and not to encourage other people to do what they did, right? If we didn't lock up thieves, if we didn't punish thieves, business could not survive, right? So that's the point, is we do that to punish the individual, but also send a message to other people that might want to do that to say, you're going to get caught, all right? So it wouldn't make sense that Paul is in jail for preaching Jesus on the streets, and then other people would step up and be like, yeah, we're going to go do it, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. They were trying to bring fear into their lives, but that's not what it says. It says the believers get more bold, and Paul says they are filled with less fear. They have less fear going out. So here's something to think about. None of these things would have happened if Paul was focused on himself and getting out of prison. Think about this. When I go through struggle, I want out. Can you identify? All right? When I go through a struggle, I want to get out of it as fast as possible because I don't like it. All right? And I'm sure many of us can say those kinds of things. It's not my first instinct to figure out how God's working in the situation. That's usually not my first instinct. All right? I tense up, I worry, I get frustrated. I may even go looking for sympathy to kind of, help lick my wounds and make me feel a little bit better about life, right? That's kind of, would you agree? Shake your head yes, you don't have to say anything out loud. Okay. Just make sure I'm not, I'm feeling kind of alone. I'm looking for sympathy right now. But I don't sit back and go, oh, this is nice. Like I wouldn't go through a trial and sit back and go, oh, that's awesome. Thanks God for my trial. I get to suffer some more, right? That's not typically our attitude towards this kind of thing. But I get the sense that Paul is wise in this. He talks about joy. He talks about joy throughout Philippians, throughout his time in jail. He says, in this I rejoice, because he sees God at work. And he uses this time to encourage the Christians in a number of places. And it's his attitude in the face of struggle that demonstrates God's power. I want to say that again because it applies to us as well. It's his attitude in the face of struggle that demonstrates God's power in his life. The same thing can be said about you. It is your attitude in the face of struggle that demonstrates God's power in your life. Paul could have very easily organized the Christians to encourage him in his time of weakness. He could have even set up a jailbreak, I'm sure. He had enough people behind him. But no man-made tactic would advance the gospel if God wanted him there in the first place. If Paul would have circumvented what God wanted for him at that time, which I believe God is sovereign, I believe that if God didn't want Paul in jail at that time, he would have kept Paul out of jail at that time. In fact, at one point, God sends an earthquake to the jail. And Paul stays in the cell. The Roman guards are freaking out like, oh my gosh, we're going to get fired, we're going to get killed because this is our job to keep the prisoners hostage. And Paul can hear him talking. He says, no, we're back here. We're still here. We didn't leave because this is where God wants us. You see, there are a lot of times when we go through struggle that is exactly where God wants us. We look at God and we go, what, don't you love me? Don't you care about me? Don't you care about my happiness? You notice where that goes? Don't you care about my happiness? And God goes, yes, I very much care about your happiness, but I care more about your holiness. I care more that you're paying attention to me and not to yourself. I care more that you're paying attention to what I want to accomplish and not what you want to accomplish. So listen, sometimes God needs us to go through struggle. And it's our responsibility to discern why God is taking us through the storm. Being in jail was of no benefit to Paul. Okay? But it advanced the gospel in two ways. It gave Paul an audience of which he would have never had, the imperial guard. He said the imperial guard has now heard about the gospel. It doesn't say that they've all accepted and become believers, but they've all heard it. And it pushed other Christians into a setting where they had to step into the gap and fill Paul's void, therefore multiplying the number of people evangelizing and advancing the gospel. So what we take away from this is that God will use our suffering to advance the gospel. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that a great... If you care about the gospel, if you are gospel strong, then you have to recognize this. And you have to be ready to walk through the storm. The second thing I want to tell you about today is the gospel advances when I have the right attitude, but only when I have the right attitude about it. See, we can go through suffering all day long. We can kick and we can scream. When I was I was probably 6 years old at the time. A lot of things happened when I was sick. I was 6. I was a rotten kid when I was sick. Steal from the church. I'd throw a temper tantrum, all that fun stuff. All right, but probably around the age of 6. I don't know. I might not have been even that old yet, but both my parents worked full time, and so I would go over to my grandma's house at times, me and my sister. And we would go there, and she would babysit us for the day, usually on Tuesdays. Actually, that's how I remember Tuesdays all the time. It was the day we go to our grandma's house. And for some reason that day, I didn't want to go over to grandma's house. And my mom was getting ready to leave, and I threw myself down on the floor. And I actually remember this. Like, it's not just from the stories. I actually remember doing this. I threw myself down on the floor because I did not want to go to grandma's house. And I started kicking and screaming, pounding my hands on the ground, my feet on the ground, like a little child does a lot of time. And I was like, I don't want to stay here, and I don't like either one of you, and all that kind of stuff. And I was just yelling insults and all that kind of stuff. That's what we do in suffering sometimes, isn't it? As grown adults, we do that in our minds. Do we not? Can we admit to that? Yeah, we can admit to that. We might not actually do that because we know that'd be really immature, and if somebody caught that on camera, that would make a viral video on YouTube. Absolutely. But the thing is we do that in our minds. And in my suffering, I have this choice. I can be angry at God, I can complain, and I can be unhappy. Philippians 2:14, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks. But I can talk to people about it in a way that brings them down, about my suffering. Y'all have had someone dump on you like that before? They didn't really have a regard to say, this is what's going on. They just wanted to unload on you and put their burden on you. Like, there's a time to vent, and there's a time like that happens, and it's like, that doesn't feel very good. Okay, and in those situations, I'm not proclaiming the power of my God. You realize that? I think we all recognize that. Maybe not in the moment, but I think that we recognize that there are times that we just do not glorify and proclaim God in those times. So I'm telling people that I am the most important thing to me, right? In those times of suffering, in those times of complaints, in those times of temper tantrums, I am the most important thing in my world right now because I don't like what I'm going through. All right? Now listen, we have to vent. Like, there is an appropriate time to vent, and you need to find that trusted person that you can just like blah, 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 all over the place. Facebook is not that friend. All right? But you need to find someone that you can do that with. Because there are times where you just got to get things off your chest. And that person can't judge you and can't use those things against you. Like, you've got to find that person that won't do that to you. But there's times that you got to do that. But you have to use discernment. So look at Paul's attitude here. We're going to look at verse 18. Look at how he chooses to respond to suffering, starting with the second part of this verse. He says, yes, and I will rejoice. All right, in the midst of my suffering, yes, I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverances. And as it is in my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Is that not an incredible attitude? Like, I look at that and I go, the standard is up here, and I feel like I'm way down here. Because for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. That is heavy. That is tough, because what do we value most? We value our lives. Maybe even our family. Maybe you could make an argument for my family's lives. I would jump in front of a bullet instantly. For my wife, for kids, for whatever. But I still value my life immensely. But he says no matter what, Christ will be honored, because to live is Christ. And so life then equals Christ. And if he loses that life, then he counts it as a gain. I mean, think about that. Losing life is never seen as gain in our culture, is it? Like, we try to do everything we possibly can to prolong life, from plastic surgery to medicine to whatever it is. But that's not how Paul thinks. Why do you think that is? I mean, think about that. Why do you think Paul assumes that? It's not just because he's a super Christian. Like, he is a man. He is a logical, thinking, tempted man. And so he thinks like we do. And for him to be able to say, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain, how in the world can you have that attitude as not someone who is God, but as a man? Maybe it's because his life, the life that he lives right now, isn't his own. Maybe it's because the life he's living right now isn't complete yet. That while it represents Christ and while he's probably happy to be alive, it's not what he truly desires. That his death will bring about a new life, one hidden away with Christ in his righteousness that Paul maybe could never attain on his own. You see, this is the power of the gospel at work in his life. Now, he's come in contact with Jesus. You know, when he was on the road to Damascus, big light blinds him. He didn't actually see Jesus, but he came in contact with him. And the life that he had is dead to sin, and so he has to live in a new life. Let me tell you something this morning. The life that you live today, if it isn't in Jesus Christ, you are living on borrowed time, and it will end. The life we need to live is Christ, because he gives new life. He gives new life. And so this life, when Paul says to live is Christ, to have life is to live in Christ. And to die is to realize new creation. Something that isn't hindered by sin. Something that isn't hindered by shame and sorrow and temptation and all of these things. It is a new life in the presence of our holy God and Father for all eternity. It is what we absolutely desire or should desire and put before our own lives. That's how he can say, yes, and I will rejoice. You see, when we suffer strong, the gospel advances. When we have the right attitude, the gospel advances. And when we suffer strong, the gospel advances because it strengthens other saints. I want you to remember that this morning because this is so important. You see, Paul can rejoice because the gospel is advancing on all fronts. Wherever the saints go, the message goes with them. There's somehow no regard for themselves. Because 100% of the time, they 100% trust in the one of whom they serve. Who do they serve? Jesus. Yeah. They serve Jesus. So 100% of the time, their trust is in in the one that they serve. To them, life is to serve Christ, and to die is an absolute gain. There is no regret because in this movement, in this moment, whether in suffering or in action, their service is to the Almighty, to the Lord God, to God the Father in heaven who created all things, whose breath is inside of us today. You see, listen to Paul's encouragement starting in verse 27 of chapter 1. He says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you, that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel and not frightened in anything by your opponents. Skipping to verse 29, for it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffered for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. Paul is encouraging a couple of things here in the face of suffering. One, he's saying, live your life in a way that not only glorifies God, but gives no one a reason to denounce God. He's saying struggle is coming. Not only does your faith in Jesus include belief and marvelous hope, but it includes suffering and conflict as well. He's saying in the middle of that struggle, I want to hear about you. In the middle of your struggle, I want to hear about you. Why would Paul want to hear about them? He says, I want to hear your life is being lived in such a way that people talk about your radical generosity, your radical faith, your radical courage, your radical attitude. And even when life downright stinks, I want to hear about how you are serving the Lord. Here's what I think God is trying to tell you today. That when we suffer strong, we strengthen the saints and we advance the gospel. When we suffer strong, it encourages others around us to maintain hope in the gospel. Think about it. If the person next to you is going through hell on earth and they are downcast, without hope, and just pessimistic about the whole thing, you're going to look at them and want to encourage them, I hope. But ultimately, you're not at all going to be encouraged by that, are you? Are you? If someone next to you is dealing with something and they're trying to sing a song in worship and they do not have hope in the Lord, if they are not gospel strong and they are not suffering strong, are you going to be encouraged by that? No, you are going to be drained by that, and that is not always a bad thing. But when it becomes a habit in life to go through suffering, denouncing the hope that we have in Jesus Christ, that is a problem because you have strength in the Lord. Because you should have hope in our God, because no matter what you face, to live is Christ, to die is gain. And when you walk into church on Sunday morning and you are downcast and you have no hope, one, I hope you find encouragement because this is what that place is. But two, I hope that you remember to encourage other people. I get that life happens. And we end up in a funk. And that's just life. And I have no right to condemn that. That is the way that we are sometimes. That is the way what we got to walk through. And I will not condemn that. But tell me, wouldn't it be so much better, so much more encouraging, so much more God-glorifying and gospel-advancing if our struggle, if our hell on earth becomes our greatest moment of God-glorifying worship? Doesn't it matter when you are facing something and you can walk up to someone and say, it's all good. God's got it. It stinks. I'm not happy right now, but I have joy in the Lord. I know that whatever is happening is going to turn around and is going to advance what He is trying to do right now. You see, you walk into church and people come up to you and they say, I'm so sorry that your house burned down last night. And you can go, yeah, I know that, you know what, that stinks. And I lost a lot of things that cannot be replaced. I lost a lot of pictures. I lost a lot of information. I lost a lot of documents that I'm going to have to do a lot of things now to get back. But it can't steal my joy in the Lord. It can't steal away the way that I feel. It can't steal away my worship because that's what I'm here for today. I'm here to worship. I'm here at church because I want to encourage others in the hope of the Lord. How are you doing? How was your weekend? How can I pray for you? Would you not be blown away if something like that happened? Would you not feel like, man, my God is awesome if you ran into that on Sunday morning in the middle of church, on the street with another Christian? Like, that's weird. Because a lot of times we want to go, yeah, man, it's terrible. Like, I just don't know how I'm going to make through, you know. And we want to play up that sympathy card, and we want sympathy from others. And I get it because I play that card a lot myself, all right? But our God is stronger than that. Our God is so much better than that. Your hope in our God should be so much better than that, because it's exactly what Paul is doing right here, and he's showing us what it looks like to have complete trust in the Lord, even in times of intense suffering. Listen, I get that you love Jesus. I get that you serve the Lord. I get that you love God, but I want to call you into a joy that brings about a peace that surpasses all understanding, because this life is all about Christ, and if we lose it because we're professing Him, then it's complete gain. And the investment has returned with interest, and we can rest in the arms of our God for all eternity. When you stand firm in the midst of suffering, you strengthen the saints. You encourage other Christians to continue their fight and their stance against suffering. Do you see how that works? When you stand strong, other people can stand strong. When you have hope in the Lord, you encourage other people to have hope in the Lord. But when you decide to steal away from that, other people fall down too because they go, man, I don't know how you do it. And I'm like, I don't know how I do it either. It's blind leading the blind. But if you can just endure it just a little bit longer, you give them hope that the battle can be won. And they can hang on that much longer, long enough to fully realize the power of the Spirit at work in each and every single one of us who have professed Lord, Jesus is Lord. You see, when you suffer strong, the gospel advances. When you suffer strong, you strengthen the saints.